Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, a podcast for creative people that want to tell new stories in new ways and have sustainable artistic careers. I'm Jonathan Ball, and I hold a PhD in creative writing, and I'm the author of many books, including poetry, fiction, nonfiction, and comics. I also own a company called Stranger Fiction. Stranger Fiction is a new publisher of unconventional genre fiction, but we also help people learn how to be more creative and have better careers. We also work with companies that need to stand out from the crowd. And Stranger Fiction, of course, also publishes this podcast. So go to strangerfiction.ca where you can find a ton of free stuff you won't see anywhere else, including the show notes for this episode. I'm really pleased to be talking to GMB Chomichuk today, who's an artist and a writer and somebody I've done a lot of, I've known for a long time. I've done a lot of work with. We're talking about The Eye Collector, which is a comic series that we have coming out of Heavy Metal. Heavy Metal's Virus Comics imprint. And so I just want to dive right into this. You can get a sense of who Gregory is and what we're doing together. This went on quite a while. We had a lot to talk about. So there's actually going to be a second part of this episode, which is going to be available from Gregory's podcast, Super Pulp Science. So on Thursday, check out Super Pulp Science, get the second part of this interview. Don't forget to check out The Eye Collector itself, which is out coming out of Heavy Metal. So you can go to Virus Comics, Heavy Metal, The Eye Collector. All those words with which are great comics. My guest today is GMB Chomichuk, who is my co-creator for The Eye Collector, a graphic novel and comic book miniseries coming out of Heavy Metal. So this is one where Gregory, I really want. Let's just dive right into it. I'll talk a little bit about how we came to do The Eye Collector.
Yeah, how did it
welcome
start?
to Writing the Wrong Way, where we talk about
for
how
me,
writing
it goes
works,
real far back
because
the best writers risk
kind of started
but I'm
in
not
like
talking to a writer
2001,
I'm talking to an agent.
2002. I remember
come to me about agents
distinctly. It was kind of in the wake of September 11th, actually.
The kinds of questions that I
everybody was just sort of feeling discombobulated and didn't really
I think
know
the best way to do this
what was going on.
Really
I had friends asking me, like, did they think we were going to
what you'll see in the description of
war
this,
now, or what was going on? Like, it was just kind of a very shell-shocked sort of time.
There's links in the description
in that
for this episode.
Period. The university was a very
the manuscript wish list that Emmy has.
It was a place where nobody really knew what to do next. Like, they didn't know, should they be having classes, should they not be having classes. Like, it was just very, confusing. And around that same time, I had this reading list that my professor, George Tolles, had given me. Now, George Tolles is film and literature professor at the University of Manitoba, but he's also the screenwriter for many of Guy Maddin's movies. If you don't know Guy Maddin, he's very send people to well-known art filmmaker in Canada and internationally regarded. So I had kind of gravitated to George in a couple ways. One was because he's just a great prof. He's was my favorite prof. But also he was at that point in time straddling this interesting line of being a prof, but also actually making real movies. And so I really liked him. We got along really well. We had a lot of the same interests in terms of art. And we both really liked. He said to me, you should really read more German romantics on Amazon and stuff. You'd like the German romantics. So he gave me a little reading list, and on that list was The Sandman by E.T.A. Hoffman, which is a fairly well-known story, but not a really often read story. E.T.A. Hoffman's best known for about how writing the Nutcracker the best writers like the kind of works that served as the basis for that. Schuster, but his writer and arguably most important work is this short story called Sandman, which was the story that Sigmund Freud used to develop his idea of the uncanny. This book, very famous essay called On the Uncanny. So I read this short story, and I was so taken with the short story. Plus, I had Guy Maddin in my head because I by Mythos and really kind of been absorbing that. Check out Thread, and I was just so enthusiastic about George and kind of doing stuff with George. I kind of reoriented my whole life to take a master's degree where I was going to work with George, and the Eye Collector was going to be my thesis.
Add a quick
it wasn't called the Eye
here,
Collector, it was called the Sandman.
I
was going to write a feature-length screenplay adaptation of this out of copyright
Zach Schuster.
E.J. Hoffman story, and really just sort of transform it and change it. And make it my own. So that screenplay was really the first draft of this
I really
project.
recommend this book.
And then you can kind of fast forward a little bit. And find again, that was like a long process to put that project together. But while I was putting that project together, is when I met you. So maybe you want to take over and kind of dive in to the story here.
Well,
welcome to Writing the
that was
Wrong
much
Way.
more comprehensive than I expected to get as to your build-up to that. I have to
sometimes the best writers also risk being
more
publishers.
tongue-in-cheek.
And I get a lot of questions about self-publishing. I've done some self-publishing experiments in my time.
Through a
but I
feat
primarily
of charlatanism and legerdemain, managed to get myself into an advanced creative writing program
I wanted to
that I had no
somebody on here
reason really or credentials to be a part of, and that's where I met you.
And really dived into that world. We're going to talk to Z.F. Sigurdsson.
One of the things that I liked about your writing the whole time was that it was unabashedly
you'll find all sorts of links
esoteric,
to get
strange,
more information,
and a little bit Byzantine.
These books,
and then it would usually end on a really kind of amusing punchline that took all the piss and vinegar and sort of
I kind of like outroing just
and mixed it all together into this like little sort of strange milieu. So like all this to say, I liked the writing. I liked your attitude.
You might even want
about
to kill
how
the thread
writing
one.
In a lot of ways is kind of bullshit.
Take a look at
and that you should just make stuff
are there ones
and try
here you
stuff
think
and do stuff. And sometimes people like it, and sometimes they won't.
No, I mean it's up to you.
And so we kind of kept in touch after that.
In my experience, people are
initial class,
tuning out at that point.
I of course
the episode, right? They're not always
hosted that very interesting group of writers at my own house after that class was finished. For a couple of years, we had a writers group.
I would maybe let's just forget about the one on the back, except for
always kind of flirted with the idea that there might be a project that we could find to do,
but maybe the rest of them will just kill.
I guess I was working on the Imagination Manifesto.
I even like
this would have been like 2004
like some of mine. I even like just cut
time.
people off mid-sentence.
And we got together, and I was showing you some of that stuff, and you were saying, "Oh, I have this screenplay. Oh, maybe it could be a graphic novel. I don't know what it could be. Could you do some imagery for it?" And it was actually one of the first times that my work was ever stolen and republished. Without my knowledge or consent, by a German publication. I had posted on my blog back in those days, people blog,
and how the best writers risk being strange.
So did I.
And I have with me,
and I posted some imagery from our E.T.A. Hoffman sort of exploration of this character that we started to call the Eye Collector, and it was just this weird image of this amorphous blob-headed creature with all these different eyes holding a bunch of holding a handful of eyeballs, and it was just us playing around with the horror and macabre elements. And then later I found out that image and a number of things from the blog had been stolen and reprinted in a German magazine.
This is like in 2008 or something. So somewhere some time ago, you had great words that go great keep in mind, together. So let's just dive we're talking 2021, and the first issue of the Eye Collector has come out. And we were doing this 5-issue story.
Next two for Keith,
right?
I guess.
But what we're talking about, this is like when we're talking now. But what we're talking about is back in 2005 and 2006.
I'm trying to think of where. Like 15 years previous, we had played around with it, and I guess all of this to say that when you start working on a project, you never know when you'll actually be able to.
And that it's worthwhile to explore ideas.
I talk about how genre gets made. I'm here with a special guest. All of those things. Collaborator, Dr. Jonathan Ball, what is now award-winning writer of a project that is very different from E.T.A. Hoffman's original story, very different from your original on our new book from Heavy Metal, and very different from anything I've ever worked on.
How the best writers risk being strange.
But all of it possible because we just
one of my good friends
kept saying there's something here, there's something
was visiting my class at the University of Winnipeg.
So and there's a couple sort of steps in there that I think are important to just quickly note and to maybe give a few people credit for. So one thing that kind of was happening in here was I had taken, like I say, I had gotten a degree with this master's thesis,
participating to all the students for the great questions.
And then I started to get deeper and deeper into filmmaking and screenwriting. And at one point we were, of course, you and me had this writers group, and this is a part of that was hosted at your house that you mentioned. But additionally, I started hanging out with some screenwriters, and we had a sort of different writers group going on where we just sort of show up at this one bar and we'd hang out in the corner, and we would have read each other's scripts before this and giving each other feedback on it. And one of the people in that
next week we'll
group was a very casual group that would really show up sometimes check out and so on. But one of the people in that group was
especially his
the writer-director Danishka Esterhazy, who's done a really great film recently called Level 16 that got her a lot of acclaim. And she actually, her next film is The Slumber Party Massacre. She's remaking that. She remade it. She's putting together now. So she's, she was reading this script and she said to me, she goes,
check the
this doesn't really work as a movie at all because it isn't like you've got this character who's a kid for the first 30-40 minutes, second part, and then you got this guy who is an adult. This is hosted like he just jumps forward into being an adult. She's like, imagine how that would play out in a movie. She's like, you're with
ask questions.
Haley Joel Osment for 30 minutes, then he's dead. He never comes back, and then all of a sudden Tom Cruise is in there, and she's like, there's just no way to make that movie. Like nobody's going to allow you to make a movie with that structure.
An interview with her
and the audience will feel like it's kind of two movies. So she kind of was like, either you need to kind of normalize it by doing a bit of a cross-cutting thing. She goes, or maybe it shouldn't be a movie, and this is really more about novel structure. Like you might just want to kind of think about it more like a book or something. And she was really right about that. But I was like, I instantly saw that she was right. She was on and a couple other people were kind of saying similar things. And I also, though, didn't want it to be a novel. I was like, why take a prose short story and adapt it to a prose novel? Like, it just is like, I know people have done that kind of thing, but it just seemed weird and dumb to me. So I kind of didn't know what to do.
We talk about how writing works,
so like,
how writers work, and how the best writers.
I was like, well, it's kind of lame to adapt a short story as a novel, but I was like, but what if? Then I kind of, one of the again, kind of with talking to you and Aaron Morey, seeing some of your visual work.
Aaron is an excellent
translator. Because when I met you,
one of the more interesting.
You say you work in the Imagination Manifesto, but really you were doing a novel version of the Imagination Manifesto. And it wasn't until I got to know you a little while that I actually realized you also drew.
She's just an excellent
and had a really interesting person, an illustrator and an artist
again.
And so as I started to see,
really encouraged you to
like as I was kind of seeing more of your actual visual work,
one book by Aaron only,
and in reading also your prose work, I started to realize
radical translation of Fernando Pessoa.
You and I had similar interests in terms of the kinds of like themes we were interested in. This particular discussion was hosted this idea of what is reality. What is somebody's perception of reality, and how does it twist and distort and fall apart and things of this nature. And we were also very interested in
discussion. As long as we're being academic about it, we might as well get into one of the things that I'm very fascinated with is the semiotic arrival at meaning.
Synthesize.
And so, the nerd heart in me that owned a comic store and makes comics and does all these other things was always brushing up against this other part of me that recognized that, the real is that which can be recreated, and that when you represent an image over and over, it acquires meaning. And isn't that just what comics are? And don't things acquire popularity simply because we've seen them a bunch? That their inherent value is sometimes in question, and that it's only their repetition that gives it meaning. And there's all of these things that are usually not
get it organized
useful in a career building exercise.
Not even
trying to make comics, but these were the kinds of conversations you and I would have.
There's like 5 other folders,
and it was fun to explore.
But yeah, just let me know how it works.
We were both reading Baudrillard. We were both interested in the surrealists. We both really liked collage. I wasn't making art, like visual art, whereas you were also writing.
You as well,
but like,
you were making visual. This was right around the time you made a short film and then sold it to the Comedy Network.
I guess so. I just never think of myself. Like at best, I was
so that
doing some indie photography that wasn't.
I thought I had,
but I always like wanted to kind of do what you were doing. Like I always wished I had a more visual eye and visual style, and I felt that I did.
And
words,
people pulling it from an app,
I just felt like very in sync with you in terms of what you were interested in.
The feed is coming from
and additionally, I want to say we got along, which I think is really important. If you want to work with somebody,
SoundCloud is just not.
Yeah, it is a big deal.
Perfect.
There's another side of it too, and I think it's important if we're talking about, if you're talking about creative collaborations and ones that work and ones that don't work.
You don't need those files.
One of the things that I find myself playing different roles in different collaborations. And I collaborate with lots of different people on lots of different kinds of projects. And sometimes my role is
what I can do, what I was thinking of doing,
like an encouragement
sending you another version
machine
with the intros and
where the other people's best work is brought forward when I remind them everything.
I can download them, right?
Yes.
And sometimes my role is as an architect to say, like, these are the different moving parts we need to put into this project. Sometimes it's as a writer just to provide words, and other people will have those.
And just any person can do that, right?
Because
I noticed, like, I can do that off.
Take other people's words
Super Pulp Science, I can
to provide a visual input. And one of the things that I've always appreciated about our collaborations on this and on some other projects, not yet announced, is that I never have to take the time to tell you or encourage you
first episode last week,
or
he talks a lot
in
about
the
I hooked up with Emmy.
actual
agent.
value of artistic expression that may or may not be commercially important.
But yeah, we'll post that on Thursdays.
I never have to convince you that we're going to make art first,
so then by the
and then figure out how to sell it second.
In a couple weeks.
Sure.
That's an argument I have a lot with people. That you have to make a thing before you can decide whether it's even worth selling.
And I'm trying to find a way to.
I think it's your poet's heart that knows that creative expression
just emailed me about it, and I just
a valuable part of being alive. And that if you make enough of something, then you can decide what to do with it. And so the eye collector is one of those places where we just kind of said, okay, well, we're going to make this thing.
That's what it is.
Who knows what it's for? But let's just make it.
Preloading the stuff in there.
The deal I made with myself when I was very young, Gregory, I grew up in a very small town.
But she had
it was isolated. It wasn't like today.
I just haven't had
the internet. It was just the beginnings of the internet. Was like, boobs and Nirvana lyrics. Like that was the whole intro. It wasn't yet like people connecting,
and what I'll end up
and it wasn't yet like
Dan,
is a thing that would help you
sort it out precisely. But what there
will be in terms of that connection
here is there will just
across the world.
I
was in a town of 100 people. It was extremely isolating. I was the only person who cared about any of the things I cared about. And when I made a vow when I was very young, like I would. Now I kind of regret this vow, but I made a vow that like I was so bored, and I just vowed that I would, when I grew up and I moved out, I do have to be bored again.
So like writingthewrongway.com.
So my sort of way that I
wherever this stuff is going to be,
my way that I also kind of made a few promises to myself in terms of just think like my life and creativity. So one of them was that I was going to be a writer, and that's just what I was going to do. And whether, I succeeded or failed in it, I was going to be doing it. And so I was always just sort of working on like trying to figure out how to succeed in it. But also, but the more important thing for me was to do it. And so there was also this sort of thing that went along with it where I made a deal for myself. And this kind of ties in what you're talking about. Like I made a deal to myself very early on in my life and writing career that I was going to allow myself to be as weird as possible in the work and not worry about its commercial
and you say that
potential.
I've got all these old tapes too. Like
but then after I was the flip side of that deal was.
So I got to dig them out.
I wouldn't worry about the commercial potential of anything I was doing as I was doing it. But when I was done doing it, I would just pretend it had commercial potential.
The little ones, yeah.
I used to do whatever I could to
there's got to be some cool stuff in there. I know that like
as if it was
I remember distinctly. Even if Black one is really cool.
Even if nobody said
at one point,
Frank Black
and even
if I
for saying something,
knew it probably wasn't.
And he starts talking about aliens.
So I just never wanted to get in that trap. I think a lot of people get into. So like they try to change what they're doing to be more commercially viable, or they sort of give up their ambition. people because they know they're doing something
started,
too much like the Pixies.
At that time, it's 2021 now, but in 2000,
not signing up like the Pixies.
In 2001,
just
trend.
It was just a great little moment. But
writing pitches.
There's a bunch of like cool stuff in those archives. I just got to figure out.
Write the next vampire novel. Write the next whatever that thing was.
Well,
this was like a big part of how we were, and I was so disgusted by that as a notion.
The tape player, because that will just plug in.
That you should write on trend
and record it digitally.
Because for me, writing is always about self-archaeology.
That's a great
stuff.
Not that any individual person has a whole bunch to say that everyone should listen to, but simply that you should.
Is there anything else?
Try to explore some part of yourself in the creative work, so that even if the work has no financial component, if it has no artistic merit, at least you grew a little bit as a person when you're done making it.
See, I never had that lofty ambition. I just didn't want to be bored. I thought it was boring to do what other people did. You know what I'm saying? Like my ambition was just simply, I don't want to write vampires if everyone's writing vampires. It's boring to me now, and so perhaps I didn't, but I never felt like it's artistically invalid to jump on the trend. I just thought it was stupid. And why would I want to do that? So which is probably a bit of real, kneecapping in my career, but I just, it kind of ends up in the same spot as you, right? And so I thought we were very much, I really liked how you didn't seem afraid to do weird things. And in fact, you seem to be just running headlong at the weirdness. And what we both kind of realized at a certain point, I don't think we realized this earlier, but I think what we started to realize is that how you be successful as an artist is you just keep doing the thing that other people aren't doing.
Yeah, and you just don't stop doing it. And we were both in, maybe privilege is the wrong word, but we were in privileged positions that we had life architecture in place that allowed us to make other stuff, which is a fancy way of saying that we were in a position where we had other ways to make money, and so we could make art that didn't make money.
Yeah, or at least we were tenacious enough to just find other ways to make money, So it was a bit of both things, right? But I think if we would just want to fast forward a little bit here, even though we were kind of eyeing up this collaboration early on, it never really materialized for quite some time, which, is due for a lot of reasons. One is, both of us were just sort of had various personal life reasons we couldn't just sink all our time into this thing. But the other side of it, though, is we're both, as you mentioned, we're both people who do a lot of different things, and we just kind of pursue a lot of different projects. And the idea always is well, if you do 10 things, maybe one of them will hit, and then I'll follow that one for a while, right? And so it just sort of was a situation where we both were doing a lot of work, but we weren't really working on this thing together, even if we kind of crossed paths and worked on something else here and there together. But finally, I kind of got to the point where I really wanted to take comics more seriously. And
I'm glad you brought up that seriousness moment, because I also had reached a place at that, just in the last couple of years where I no longer did things that were whimsical for the sake of their whimsy. I also decided that I would only work with people who were serious about their whimsy.
Yeah.
Right? It's okay to have flights of fancy. In fact, I love that and encourage that in almost everyone I meet. I always want people to try and experiment with stuff. But if you're only experimenting and you're going to do it for a couple of weeks and then you're done, I do not want to work on a creative project with you. If you're serious about a year-long exploration of some weird thing, man, let's sign up and really delve into it. And that's kind of, you had said, I'm going to be serious about making graphic novels. Let's do this. And I had a place in my schedule where I really wanted to just explore some different kinds of visual contexts. And then lo and behold, the world decided that we both needed a break from our regular workaday lives, and they canceled the whole world with a global pandemic, and we finally had some time to work on this one.
Just so that people could do the eye collector.
I don't want to reduce the amount of suffering that this has caused into my own
But even without the pandemic, we had put the infrastructure in place to work on it before that. Like what we had done leading up to the pandemic hitting was, again, I decided, I want to get a bit more serious about doing this. I needed a project that I felt like where I was very intimidated by writing comic. And so I was like asking, I don't know if you remember, but I was like asking you like questions, incessantly about making comics, where I'd be like, how many pages should a comic be? How many, what do I do about this? What do I do about that? Like where should the surprises go? Like you'd give me all these like very technical answers to questions, which I had really been appreciating. And so I kind of started to get to the point where I was like, well, if I need to work on a comic and I become a real comics writer, there's a couple of things that have to happen. I started like, I'm very analytical. So I started like going through the checklist. I'm like, the easiest way to do this would be to do with Gregory, because then if I don't know what I'm doing, I can just ask him. I go, and also I know Gregory is not going to draw exactly what I tell him to draw. So if I screw up the script, he'll just fix it. Right.
It's funny you say that, because one of the things that I find interesting or hard to get across to some collaborators is that if you just need an illustrator, I'm not your guy. If you're willing to explore the illustration potential around this idea, I'm interested in that. And so, you inadvertently had created that scenario for yourself.
Yeah. And then I also did a thing that I think a lot of people don't do, but need to kind of like, think about doing, like at that sort of stage, is that I had then like spent some money buying pages from you, actually getting, a group of pages together. So I sunk some, personal money, like, a good little chunk of change into getting some pages together, so that I could then put together a grant proposal or some, pitches out to magazines or not magazines, but publishers and so on. And then it so happened that that investment, paid off after a few grant allocations, and we got some money to put together an issue. And then, as that issue started to come together, I got another grant to do a bit more, and we kind of started to ladder it up like that. But there's a couple of things that happened in there. So one was, I did some personal investment to kind of put me in place where I could get some actual, grant money from the Manitoba Arts Council and the Winnipeg Arts Council, who have really been generous with this particular project. But also in the spirit of collaboration that you're talking about, this is when, in this sort of mix, is when I decided that I wanted to kind of offer to bring you on as like a full co-creator who actually has a stake in the ownership of this and so on, rather than, a hired gun.
Yeah, because when we were talking originally, it was like, hey, I'm going to, I want to do this graphic novel. And I said, okay, well, yeah, I illustrate graphic novels professionally. Here are my rates and here's how it would work. Here's the ways I do work. Here's the ways I don't work when I'm working in this fashion. And, you and I always had these tongue-in-cheek conversations where I would say like, unless I own it, and then it's different, yeah. Or unless I have a piece of it, then it's different. Then my rate is always different if I have a piece of it after. Because I had learned the hard way that it's really important to own your own intellectual property outright if you ever want to leverage it in another way. It's really hard to make a living as an artist. At the best of times, and these aren't necessarily the best of times. So it became, really, I had to be a little bit Machiavellian in my way of approaching this project, just because also, when you're working with a friend, it can be very difficult to mix business with friendship. And so I just had to have a certain number of things set up to create the temperature of that relationship. And then at a certain point, you just said, hey, how would you do this? What would you do this? If you're going to fix this or change this or do whatever, come and be a part of it. And that, that changes everything, because then the role of the work is not just an interpretation of somebody else's idea to the best of your ability to interpret their idea, but a scaffolding together of two sets of conditions that will then make work.
Another thing that kind of is in the mix here in terms of how I was thinking about it was, again, I had been, following your career, of course, because we, knew each other, and I'd seen all the stuff that you were doing, we're always kind of in each other's orbits there. And so I was seeing all the stuff you were doing and just kind of following all the things you had done. And I could see very clearly, like, where your work was going was very much into a space where I thought it would work for this project. And I also started to really clearly see what I thought you could bring to the project on top of and beyond like what I was doing or what I thought I could bring to it. And so something that kind of like, on one hand, this was a story that I had been sitting with for a long, long time and had a very personal like connection to, and didn't necessarily just want to part with. But at the same time, it was a story that I was really loosely basing on an existing property, like very loosely. By the time that we're like, looking at the new version, like it's so far removed from even my original adaptation, which was already very far removed from the original story, that the Sandman is almost like a man in the moon at this point, more than the Sandman. But and of course, we're not calling it the Sandman, it's the Eye Collector, right? But it had just gotten so far away from the original idea. It had gotten more personal in many ways, but I just kind of been with the idea so long that it kind of felt like and I'd seen so much of your stuff that I knew that even if you changed a lot of it, we both had so many similar ways of looking at this kind of material that the core of it would stay the same. And so I felt like the best way to get the best stuff out of you, really, and really, I thought you could really elevate the project in a way that beyond just providing artwork and illustration for it. So I thought it was, really a great kind of, match made in hell in that respect.
Well, it's nice of you to say that. It's important, I think, for the listener to know that usually what would happen is Jonathan would provide me with a script page, and 70% of it I would kind of try to cling to the main beat. But then if a visual element, struck, I would go immediately very far afield of the original concept and maybe twist it or look at it from a different point of view, or include repetition of imagery instead of the called for script beats. So from a certain type of writer's point of view, it would have been a nightmare to see that kind of change arrive every time a script page was delivered. And instead it became a way of Jonathan would write this thing in the script pages that would say, this is what I think should happen unless you can draw something more interesting. And then it became a challenge for me to try and say, okay, what would be a more interesting way to represent this that is in keeping with the previous pages and in keeping with where we want the story to go, and is in keeping with this experimental language that we're trying to, develop. And none of that having anything to do with what a typical substantive editor would say, this is good for the reader, right? We didn't do that at the beginning.
Yeah, like I feel very confident in my skills as a writer, but it was a territory. Like, this is the first comic I've ever written. So I certainly didn't feel like I was like the god of comics, who needed to come in and art direct the whole thing. In fact, I kind of really felt I was going to have to lean on you. And so, it would just make sense for you to kind of be a co-creator in the whole thing. I also just felt it would give you a bit more like emotional stake in the project, and you'd kind of take it more seriously,
well, it's always the way it works, right? If anyone wants to take a page and figure out how to apply it to their own process, if you make people part of a project rather than just complicit in it, you'll get a lot more out of them.
Yeah, and maybe we should start to kind of talk a bit at this point about where we brought Lyndon into the project, and kind of how our process of working was. You kind of start to touch on it, but why don't you talk in a bit more of a precise way about how things kind of went from my script pages to the final page?
Okay, but before we do that, before we get there, let me counter offer a question to you, John.
All right.
We are pitching The Eye Collector as a horror story. Why don't you first tell me what a horror story is supposed to be, and whether you think The Eye Collector succeeds or fails in this idea of being scary?
Sure. Well, I have really specific ideas about what a horror story is or should be. So, take what I'm saying with a bit of with the grain of salt of, that this is coming from my very specific point of view on what horror is or should be. So I could talk about this forever, but just to really quickly kind of run through the concept. I think when horror is at its best is when it is occupying kind of radical point of view. And this radical point of view gets symbolized in the monster. I think the best horror has a monster that has really particular qualities. It's a thing that should not be. It's a thing that is doing things it should not do. It's this abnormal, transgressive thing. But I think it's also symbolic of a fate worse than death from the point of view of the protagonist, which is always at some level coming back to this shattering of reality. I think the monster represents this total antithesis of what the protagonist, the victim or potential victim thinks the world is. But also, and I think the best horror goes a step further of arguing thematically that the monster is the truth and the monster is right, and the monster is the moral center of the story in a strange way. Like on the surface, it seems like the monster is, the problem, because fundamentally it's here killing everybody, destroying everything. But I think the best horror, or at least the most radical and interesting horror to me, also goes a step further and posits that this monster is correct to do the things that it is doing. It represents the true point of view. This is what reality is the horror story is so much about, it seems like this monster shouldn't exist, and yet here it is, we have to get rid of it to re-establish our sense of reality. And I think like the best horror just kind of insists that the monster can't be killed, that the monster is the truth and everything else is a lie. The monster is not part of the coming from the outside, not, this alien creature, but actually something fundamental to reality itself. And in a way, it's more real than everything else, even though it might seem like this dream-like thing. And it has a point of view that is, in a strange sort of way, correct. And the solution that very few protagonists ever succeed in, like the solution to the horror story on a certain level is to stop being horrified by the monster. But of course, almost nobody, and just accept its truth. If you can accept the truth of the monster, then you can survive. And you see that in horror. There's a trope in horror where you see that play out in a very simplistic way. That's the trope where people just ignore that the monster is real. They can't believe it, and so therefore they fall victim to it. That's where people like they find like a body drained of blood with 2 punctures in its neck, and they're like, "Oh, what could do this?" And it's, right? Like that's the trope where it's like they just can't believe monsters are real. Of course, monsters aren't real. Therefore, they fall victim and are killed by the monster. And only the people. So there's like that's the one class of victims in the horror story. There's another class of victims that accept the truth. At a certain point, they just can't deny anymore that the monster is real. They have to accept that the monster is real, but they refuse to. They're trying to get rid of the monster, and they're trying to deny its reality, shut it out of reality, destroy it, put it back into hell, whatever. Right? I think the most radical horror goes this extra step, and the protagonists have to accept and become monsters. And I'm not saying this is what happens in The Eye Collector. I would argue. there's some complicated things happening in the eye collector, but I think there's that level at which, as people read this story, like the eye collector, what I realized at a certain point in our collaboration was, as I was rewriting my old versions of things, is that I kind of moved the eye collector from being this, threatening, nightmarish, kind of more stock figure to being this figure who really sees himself as right. And he's just there to help from his point of view, from the eye collector's point of view. And the eye collector, of course, has all the points of view, right? From his point of view, he doesn't understand why these people are so terrified. They should just, all he's trying to do is give them what they want. And really, in a strange sort of way, the most frightening thing in this story is the revelation of what they truly want. And that's in some respects the things they start to fight against. So that doesn't get us too fully in. That's just kind of staying on the theme level without giving away too much plot.
Yeah,
but
and this is all to say that one of the reasons why, when you ask how did I approach the page, I think what's important for for anyone interested in this story or the way that we work to understand is that I had this conversation, which you just summarized, many times with you in many different ways and many different iterations for years. So before I approached the page, I knew that my collaborator had a certain range of changes that would be acceptable given their point of view on what horror is. Right. So I kind of knew where I could traverse because of these definitions that, even as I asked you this question, I anticipated many of the ways you would summarize this because we've had this conversation. So I would keep those things, that list of things in mind whenever I would go through a script.
So that was me talking to Gregory Chomichuk about the eye collector. And remember, this is just part 1. Part 2 is coming out Thursday on Gregory's podcast, Super Pulp Science. So go subscribe to my favorite podcast, Super Pulp Science, and check out part 2 of our discussion concerning the eye collector.